What's the best, I told you so, moment? Working at a tire shop. Customer bring in a Land Rover Range Rover with air suspension for a set of tires. I watch the tire changers start to set their little scissor lift under the frame to pick it up, and I go over and stop them. I tell them that they should take it down to the second drive-on rack and use the swing jacks under the axles, or else they're going to blow out the suspension. The assistant manager overhears this and comes out into the shop saying that I just called Land Rover and they said that to turn off the air ride all you have to do is open the rear hatch and turn the hazard lights on. Just pick it up where it is and get on with it. The customer's waitin'. At that point I said, well, you heard the man. I'm going to go back down by my toolbox. Holler if you need me. About a minute and a half later, what sounds like a shotgun blast is heard throughout the shop. They lifted the truck by the frame and blew out all 4 suspension airbags. Just LKE, I said would happen. They eventually wound up putting it on the drive-on lift and using the swing jacks, just like I told them to do. Then the customer got to drive all the way from Manassas, VA to Alexandria, Virginia on the bump stops, where the shop I was working for paid $6,000 for a set of used suspension airbags to be installed. God forbid the guy who's actually worked on Land Rovers before might know what he's talking about. Even if had only been at that particular shop for 3 days. At least they started listening to me when I told them stuff. I was in freight. I delivered a pallet that was supposed to have 750 pieces. It looked a little short, so I asked the customer to count it. He refused 3 times after I explained to him if it was short they're going to deny your aim. He said don't worry. I said okay, and noted it on the paperwork that he refused to count. He signed it. 2 weeks later he called the customer service rep to report a shortage. Make a claim. The customer service rep called me and asked did I remember it. I said yep. Read the notes. She said, oh, he refused to count it. Claim denied. Thanks, bye. Lol. My roommate at the time always refused to take his keys whenever he left the house, despite me telling him not to do that, relying on the fact that I always had mine. Our shifts ended around the same time, so we would usually come home together. One day whilst we were both out I had to go back to my parents' house, which was a couple hours away. As I was pulling up to their drive, I get a call from him. Stranded in the rain, outside our place without his keys. I told him that I wouldn't be returning until tomorrow and that there was nothing I could do. He ended up staying over at one of our friends' houses. But since then he's never left the house without his keys. Ex-boss, who I was not fond of, had a vehicle he wanted to sell. He met someone who wanted to make payments on it, used private party, but take possession when they made the first payment. I told him not to do it. I said it was almost certain they will crash the car and then just stop paying, and he'll be left with a damaged cat and no money. He told me I was dumb and went ahead with the deal. Okay, whatever you say. For a couple months things were good and he was pretty smug. Then he comes in one day and tells me to research what happens if the above scenario happens. And the car was in a tow yard collecting fees. He wanted to know if he was responsible for the fees. I didn't even look up. Yup, if you want the car back you are. When I was 14 I fell down a flight of stairs and messed up my knee badly enough that I had to have surgery on it. It was a day surgery, and when I came out of anesthesia I found myself groggy and sick to my stomach. The attending nurse needed to get me up and ready to leave. But I really didn't feel well. So she's insisting that I sit up, and I'm protesting saying that if I move I will vomit. She made me sit up, telling me, you won't vomit. I promptly puked all over her. I was working in a factory that had very large pieces of machinery with large gearboxes, about the size of one of those smart cars. I noticed during my shift that while idling, one of the machines had a small spike in current draw every revolution of the motor. Idle was about 1 SRPM, so you could see it on the monitors. I put a screwdriver up against the gearbox casing and listened to it. It's a half-assed stethoscope, and could hear something sticking and then popping free as it turned. I told the supervisor that a bearing was right on the point of failure and we needed to shut it down immediately for maintenance. He ignored my warning and proceeded to queue up a job for the night shift running at 80% max load for 9+ hours. I shrugged and went home. At about 2 a.m. the gearbox failed catastrophically, causing what the crew reported as a small earthquake as the entire building shook. I turned up for my next shift, and once they explained what happened, I just looked at the supervisor and said, "Told ya so." The machine was down for nearly a year and a new gearbox had to be custom fabricated and imported from Italy because they didn't want a couple of days downtime for preventative maintenance. Told X I was passing a kidney stone and needed to go to the urgent care. She told me to suck it up, and that it was just a bit of man flu. Despite the pain, my anger had me drive her and myself to the urgent care, get a CT scan and have the doctor tell me that it was a SMM kidney stone halfway to my bladder. The look on her face when he confirmed that I was right was worth the pain and agony. I was idly bouncing an incredibly dull knife against my leg. When I say dull, I mean that it struggled to cut a banana. A friend happened to notice what I was doing and said, "That's super dangerous." I shrugged and said, "It's too dull to even make it through my apron," and punctuated my point with another, harder bounce, stabbing myself in the leg. It turns out a paring knife without an edge can still have a point. Much as my friend Dill. I told my ex-wife's new husband that she was a cheater and would do it to him. He said she wouldn't. Forward 5 years, and they're divorced. He tells me she cheated several times for long periods. He tells me he wished he'd listened. In the late 80s, I worked for my mill as a regional manager of her business. I worked very long hours for $500 OC. At some point, I told her that I deserved a raise. She asked me how much I thought that I deserved, and I replied that she couldn't replace me for less than $1,000 per week. She responded that she was sure that she could. So I said, "Fine, show me." She had trouble finding someone and finally had to pay the $1,000. But after 2 weeks, he was totally incapable of doing what I did. So she had to split it into 2 regions and hire a second guy at $1,000 per VK. After 6 months, she discovered that they teamed up to embezzle about $15,000. Of course, she never acknowledged to anyone, especially not me, that I was right and she fucked up badly. Family friend's truck was making a grinding noise from the brakes. Told him to drive something else to go hunting. Got a call the next day because he drove it 2 hours and then his brakes stopped working. He ends up needing calipers on top of the pads and rotors he would have originally needled. As a teacher, telling the head principal at my school that the way they were abusing the alternate assessment program to boost standardized test scores was not just a huge burden on teachers but also illegal, and likely to attract the scrutiny of the State Department of Education. He handed me a shitty assignment for the next year. I quit, and he ended up having to take that assignment. Teaching 16 kids with emotional disorders across 3 grade levels in one classroom. For the first month and a half of the school year they couldn't find anybody to take my place. I heard later that year that they came down hard on him for the scheme he'd concocted and ended up shutting down the alternative assessment program altogether. Told you so. DL. I was operations manager for a very small family-run company. I was putting in 80-plus-hour weeks, rarely getting a full day off. One new employee had trouble completing their job, which was extremely easy, and kept interrupting me while I was doing one of my jobs. I told them to go ask one of my bosses, since she knew exactly what to do. Later that day, I got called into the office and was asked if I thought my pay rate was too much for what I was doing. I asked the boss what they meant by that, and they said, "I don't think you are worth the amount we are already paying you, since you can't handle the job you have." I asked if they meant telling the new guy to go ask them about something on their contract, and they said, yes. It's lazy and unprofessional to have someone interrupt the owner when they are working. I walked out to catch some air, and literally received a call for an interview at a much higher paying job that I had applied for about a year earlier. I told the person on the phone that I could literally do the interview that day, if needed. They agreed, and I took a break and drove up to the interview and walked out with a job. I came back to work and put in my 2 weeks' notice and said, "If you think I'm not worth my weight, that's okay, but you'll need at least 4 people to replace me." 2 months later, they had to hire 5 people just to handle what I did. When I was 13 years old, I found out my brother was selling drugs out of my parents' house. He used to tell them he was giving away McDonald's coupons that he got from working the drive-thru. We lived in a very nice neighborhood and I knew the influx of cars would attract police attention. After asking him to stop several times, I finally caved and told my parents. I was literally in tears because I felt guilty snitching on Hearn but felt like had no other choice because he was going to ruin his life. When I told my parents, they accused me of being jealous of him for having better grades in school and called me a liar. He was able to continue on for 2 years before finally getting caught. Our home was raided and he was on the 5 o'clock news that evening. My mother watched and sobbed and I couldn't help but say, "I told you so." What could have been an easy conversation ended in federal charges and several $100,000 in lawyer fees. One time my morn and I were at Walmart and we spotted this woman who looked a lot like my aunt returning a TV. She told me to go get her attention and I said, "No, that's not my aunt." She said, "I know my sister," and proceeded to yell, "Hey fat woman," and this woman turned and glared